Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the Rogue Monkey podcast, the show where we explore the journeys of successful people who challenge the status quo and pull back the curtain on a range of different roles and professions. Before we get into today's conversation, we'd really appreciate it if once you've finished with today's discussion, you could give us a quick rate and review, as it helps capture your thoughts on our discussions. Today we are joined by performance nutritionist Jasmine Campbell. It's a great insight from a practitioner who works across so many sports and at so many different levels. We explore some of the myths in the nutrition world, as well as Jaz's work supporting the world-leading young athlete support program, AP+. Just before we dive into the discussion, a date for your diary. On Wednesday the 5th of May at midday UK time, the Rogue Monkey podcast will be going live on Instagram, with both myself and a coaching podcaster sharing our reflections on the last 12 months of turmoil in the sports and wider world. Make sure you follow at Rogue Monkey Pod for more information dropping this coming week. So, without further ado, let's get into our conversation today and episode 37 of the Rogue Monkey podcast. The journey of a sports nutritionist, innovating and dispelling myths. A conversation with Jasmine Campbell. Hi Jaz, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks for sharing some time with us today. It's been an exciting weekend at the time of recording. We've had our first proper batch of snow this year, so everyone's getting very excited.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed that this weekend.
A welcome distraction from these strange times. I've done a little introduction, obviously, to give our listeners and viewers a bit of an idea as to your background, but if you can just kind of take us through who you are, what you do, and kind of your pathway so far.
Yeah, so I'm a performance nutritionist and I have a sports science background, and I get to work with athletes of different levels, and I get to work with a range of sports as well. So I'm technically self-employed, and yeah, so each week looks quite different. And yeah, it's just something I've really enjoyed, and it's kind of been a bit of passion of mine as well as my vocation. So
how did it kind of evolve at the start? Because, you know, most kids, when they're asked what they want to do when they're like 12, either want to be an astronaut or, you know, a policeman or something like that. So how did the whole route of nutrition kind of emerge?
It was quite a strange one because I never set out to be a sports nutritionist. I knew when I was doing A-levels I wanted to work in sports, so I went through sports science undergrad, and then at a point through my undergraduate degree, I got to go. My lecturers encouraged me to go to a workshop over a day, a weekend, and it was by Basie's, and it was the English Institute of Sport were running it, and it was their physiology team, so Steve Ingham and his team presenting about what they do and how they work through an Olympic cycle and how they work with other practitioners as part of that multidisciplinary team that support an athlete. And I just decided at the end of that day, I was like, yeah, this is me. I really want to be a practitioner in sport. And I didn't necessarily know what discipline I wanted to do. So I went on to do a master's in sports science. And then I had a few years where I sort of really struggled to progress more than just doing work experience in sport. So as you all know, it's a very competitive field. There are very few opportunities that come up. So I was doing all sorts of other jobs like working in hospital, admin, waitressing, cleaning, things like that for a bit to try and keep my hand in it. And then an opportunity came up in London to work in a sports nutrition lab. So I sort of went along as someone who could help this business in different ways, but get experience of it. And I was just really lucky that they took me on for an internship. So I was seeing all of my boss's clients coming in for he was a sports nutritionist. And I was like, this is really interesting. And we had lots of students coming in, and I was telling them, and I was thinking, I feel like a bit of a fraud here because I'm not a sports nutritionist and I'm teaching these students and looking after these clients. And so we decided I was going to do a postgraduate diploma in sports nutrition, which he supported me through. And yeah, so then that opportunity finished, and then I decided to go self-employed and reach out to my network to try and get some work experience opportunities or some paid work as a sports nutritionist.
Well, that was how I guess we first met. Obviously, working the consultancy work in the world of swimming. I'm curious, you've obviously mentioned a range of sports that you've worked with. How does it differ from sport to sport? Because a lot of people, whether it's naivety or not knowing the sports world, will say, well, nutrition is nutrition. And actually, the range of sports I know you work with, there's probably some very differing needs.
Oh yeah, the needs can be wildly different sometimes, and other times it is really some similar principles throughout different sports. So I guess in terms of why I sort of enjoy what I'm doing at the moment is because I love the variation, and the variation can be sometimes working maybe with females to males, or working with quite young athletes, the age of sort of 13 years to maybe the eldest I work with is probably like 34, 35. Working with professional athletes who are funded, and that's all they do is do their sport. And then you've got athletes I've worked with where they are doing a PhD full-time as well as full-time training, or that we've got to accommodate work or family life as well. And if you think about the different sports, think about some maybe swimming races that might last for 40 seconds, a couple of minutes, and then you've got a football match that will be 90 minutes, could go into extra time. So there's lots of differences in the performance requirements for those athletes to be able to do their sport. And that's why their nutrition is different.
I'd be curious as well as to the differences, especially in team sports within a team. So, and actually, even within a sport, the individuals you work with, say you give an example there of swimming, and we're talking about, say, sprinters versus long distance, and then say for football, a goalkeeper versus a midfielder. So actually, like, how do you, because obviously time is of the essence when you're talking with big groups and stuff like that, how do you get, I guess, your core messages across, but also at the same time kind of go, well, actually, this person over here needs A and this person over here needs B?
Yeah, I think that can be a real challenge, and that depends on how much access you have to the athletes, and sometimes what level you're coming in at. So, for example, you might have a football team or some swimmers who've had lots of nutritional input, so you can really home in on the individuals and pull them up individually to their needs. And then if you, for example, come into a football team who haven't really had any nutrition support, really you want to sort of do a blanket approach and get everybody, whether it's the goalkeeper, the under 23s player, the midfielder, all up to a certain sort of like foundation level of that understanding. But I think sometimes if you just, when you've overcooked that bit, when you maybe get not as much interest, so you can then develop individuals.
Do you get, and I mean, you mentioned a range of ages that you work with, obviously the acceptance of knowledge, I guess, and guidance, does that differ from, say, working with a 13-year-old who's just kind of soaking it up like a sponge versus perhaps maybe a 25-year-old established sports person who's very much set in their ways? Do you find that's kind of a bit of a challenge sometimes?
Yeah, and it's a good challenge. It's something that you need as a practitioner to sort of keep you going and keep you on your toes. And I think that's a really good point. Sometimes, if you're at the top of your career and you're performing really well, why would you change anything? So sometimes they can be really interesting people to work with. And again, with the younger ones, sometimes they might get a little bit too into it and too almost like obsessive about it, because they just want to do everything to their best, and that's great. But sometimes you need to rein them in and remind them to be a human being and an athlete as well.
Yeah, and I think we talked about that on a few discussions so far this season around this notion of the enjoyable aspects of it. And actually, when you've got various disciplines getting involved in any sport or even other aspects of life, talking to pilots on previous stuff, and again, they were talking about, physical conditioning, and actually that forms a part of their careers. So when you're working with athletes that have, say, all of this clinical support, if you like, how do you kind of make it diverse enough that it's interesting, especially when working with the youngsters that might have an attention span of, maybe 10 seconds?
Yeah, so I think with the younger ones, and I think generally when you're speaking to athletes, you've got to make it relevant to them. So I'm not a swimmer. I don't have a swimming background. I can swim, but coming in new to the sport of swimming, you've got to, and I use my colleague, Andrew Shepherd, a lot because he was a swimmer and he's worked in swimming a long time as a nutritionist, to get things like the lingo, the terms, be like, look, what does a day look like for a swimmer, and really get to know them and what is very typical of what they do and what's very typical of the sort of culture of swimming with nutrition. And then I guess when you're sort of, so they don't just think, oh, she's just here to tell us to eat fruit and veg, or, she's got no idea what we have to do. So you need to sort of understand. And I think it's sort of like when I'm talking to maybe football players, they might look at me, think she doesn't know what she's talking about football. That I understand the importance of when they need to really perform in a game, for example, talk to them about how many goals are scored in the last 10 minutes. That's why it's really important we get your nutrition right, so you can outperform the opposition in those last 10 minutes. And so I think when you talk to them in language like that, that's when they think, oh, this is so relevant to me. And then I guess with the ages as well, it's really important that you get your priorities right for the younger ones, especially because it might just be that they need to learn that nutrition is important, it's valuable, and also it's fun as well. So it's something that they should be invested in. So they might not actually learn very much, but you're just getting them excited about food and excited about nutrition being part of their life.
And there's a level of, I guess, creativity, because, having sat in on a few of your workshops, like, putting up a list of ingredients and saying, what can you make with that? And then actually explaining to them the range of dishes they can have, especially with a lot more knowledge, I guess, around the ways you can manipulate diets. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but for example, if somebody says I'm intolerant to this, or I'm a vegetarian, or whatever it is, in the old days there might have been like one go-to, whereas now it's actually the knowledge base has got a lot better, to a point where working with young athletes, they can almost go, whatever your tastes are, whatever your requirements are, there's something out there we can do for you.
And I think that's a really good point, what you've just made then. Something that I feel quite strongly about is that we've got a lot of people that want to have a set identity when it comes to their nutrition. So they want to be, or they feel like they need to be a full vegan, for example, and that's quite a popular one at the moment, or they need to be dairy free, or they need to be something. Whereas actually, no, you don't need to be too fit in full-time something. You can be quite flexible, and you just need to think about what your needs are personally, what's practical, what works for you, rather than giving yourself a label or putting yourself in a box.
And I guess some of that, especially when you're talking performance, links to, I guess, needs versus wants and an understanding of it, because you might get a young athlete that's adamant they're whatever they want to, I only eat pasta. And you say, well, that's great, but for your sprinting, you might need something different. And they go, well, I don't want to eat that, or I don't want to try that. And you go, that's fine, but you've told me that you want to win an Olympic gold or win the national championships or whatever it is. And you do understand those two things are linked. And that kind of loops back to what you mentioned earlier about the relevance. I think too often, especially in like my early days in coaching, there was not a mystique around nutrition, but it almost felt like just a blanket approach. Everyone should try this. And I'm going to come on to myths in a minute, because I'm sure you've got a few that you can bust for us. But do you feel like that's something, not so perhaps with the youngsters now, but perhaps with the athletes that have maybe been in the sport 5-10 years, that have probably had the same presentation 25 times, maybe they're a little bit cynical about nutrition?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's one of those where if an athlete hasn't been able to get past the fact that they think they only value maybe food as fuel, and maybe they don't want to put on any weight, they want to be a certain physique, and they've been like that for a long time, then that can be quite hard to get through to them, I think, probably.
Does that become like a partnership piece of work then, in terms of having to work with the psych, for example, or the coach or the parents or whoever it is, instead of just everyone sitting in their own little isolated booths?
Yeah, definitely. Probably the coach who has the most contact with the athlete and sees them, and sometimes might be the person that reinforces these beliefs to them. So the coach is probably one of the most powerful tools or useful person in this situation. But yeah, definitely accessing all the other disciplines that athlete might come into contact.
And I guess it works both ways, in terms of the coach could actually use you to get key messages across. I remember listening to an interview a few years ago with Jess Ennis's coach, and he talked about, he was constantly hassling Jess to drink more, and she just wouldn't drink. And then they got this performance team around her, and one of the nutritionists came up with the idea of hydration strategies. and suddenly, because it had science attached to it and coming from a different person, that she was all over it. So I think it is that two-way relationship, and knowing your coaching team or whoever you're working with to actually kind of make sure it is a collaborative piece of work.
Yeah, that happens all the time. I'll meet coaches and they'll say, oh, my guys are terrible at this. I've got this great swimmer, but they always do this. And I'm always telling them. And I think that's a coach trying to do their best. And I think it's a good thing. But they're trying to be everything to that athlete. And I think your swimmer's looking at you thinking, you're a great coach. I'll do everything you say in terms of swimming technique, and I'll do your training sessions. But they'll look at it and be like, don't talk to me about nutrition. Don't get on to me about this.
Well, I want to move on to myths because, it's pseudoscience, whatever we want to call it. It's rife now more than probably ever in our history in sports. So what are the kind of common things you come up against that you're still probably shocked now that you have to actually explain to people are either not true or it's a bending of the truth?
I guess probably the biggest one, and even with athletes I work with for a while, they sometimes struggle with this, is that I think sugar is the devil. Sugar's really bad for you. And I think that comes from a lot of, what we've got in the media, when we're really concerned about the obesity epidemic, and we're concerned about the average person. We want to make sure they're, really healthy. But when we've got athletes, they've got different needs and they do a lot more than the average person. And we often forget that sugar is a carbohydrate. So often people, when I ask them, they think that sugar is a fat, and actually sugar is carbohydrate broken down. So sometimes it could be quite useful. For example, if we've got a really hard training session and we've got some porridge waiting for us at home, we get home, if we put some honey, which is sugar, on top, that can bump up the carbohydrate of that meal. Also make it a higher GI, which means that the body uptakes that sugar and transports it to those muscles that have just worked really hard to help refuel them. So that's probably quite a big one. And I think parents are often worried about the amount of sugar their children are eating, but when their children are super active and they're growing and they need a lot of energy, we don't need to worry about it as much as we would if we had a sedentary child.
How does that, I don't know what sports you work with around this question, but how does that factor into kind of weight specific sports, whether that's martial arts or other sports where actually weight plays a crucial role and you're not just dealing with performance from a fueling point of view, but you're actually having to deal with other aspects of I guess, the psychology associated with it, because people view weight as quite an arbitrary thing, whereas obviously it can be made up by so many different things, whether it's your fluid intake, whether it's muscular growth, whatever it is. So how do you deal with that kind of stuff, and are there any kind of common things you come up against?
Yeah, so whenever I worked with weight category sports before, I think it's so important that you've got to, and I've had to fight quite hard to get that time with the athlete, the coach, the surrounding team, to make sure everyone has this baseline understanding of weight. So that's making sure they understand all the components. So for example, 1 litre of water weighs 1 kilo. So I've worked with boxers who firmly believe that the more they sweat, the more weight they'll lose. And yes, you lose weight, but as soon as you drink, you're then going to put that weight back on in your body. And weight doesn't necessarily equal fat. So we talked to them about, make sure, sometimes I'll take an athlete and I know what their weight on the scales is first thing in the morning. Then I'll break it down. So I'll be like, your total body water is probably about this much. That's this weight. We've measured your body fat. We know it's about this weight. We know what your muscle mass is. It's this weight. Things like we can estimate maybe 1.5 kilos is the weight of your contents of your gut. And that can go up if you eat more fiber. That can go down if you eat less fiber. If you have a high salt diet, you're going to retain more water, etc. And also, like I said, about the carbohydrates in the muscles, for every gram of carbs, you need about 3 grams or 3 milliliters of water to store it. So that can add up to about maybe like 2 kilos for some people or more. So you could be really depleted in energy and really dehydrated and look like you've lost weight or body fat. It's not the case. So I think that's really important to get that information in so they understand that. And then in a case of I guess, foods and a strategy going forwards there, then we need to look at them understanding what their energy requirements are and matching them very, very carefully or as accurately as we can.
Yeah, and it's when you start digging down into it, it's a fascinating area. And even just say I'm not from a nutrition background, but even my basic understanding, I'm still baffled when I hear some of the things that people do or don't do or think around certain aspects of, like you said earlier, sugar's the devil. If I sweat, therefore I'm losing weight, that's a good thing. Weight is just a blanket number, that sort of thing. And there is a lot around understanding. I'm kind of jumping forwards a little bit, but there's the historical way in which nutrition was delivered, like probably most of the sports science aspects, was face-to-face workshops, or you gave people a book or a pamphlet. Whereas obviously having the online digital jump that we've all had in the last year or two, and obviously it was there before, but it's probably going to be utilized going forwards more than ever. Do you think now the ability for you to get that kind of baseline in, like before, for you to go and see an athlete in one part of the country, if they were training there, but their parents lived in another part and their coach commuted in from somewhere else, this has probably made your life a lot easier in terms of getting that base knowledge and communication with the whole team?
Yeah, it has. I think we need to hang on to positives. I think maybe it will change the way that we work slightly, and especially improve communication for sure. It's very hard when you turn up to a training session. It's great for me because I get to watch and see what's going on, but people's time is limited. So you can only have a quick 5-minute conversation here, and you don't want to take anything away from that training session either. Add a distraction. So yeah, things like having time or ease for things like this is really good.
Brilliant. Well, it picks onto it again, another project that I know you're involved in that I want to unpick a little bit. We've talked about, especially whether it's young athletes or just professional athletes having a bigger team, everyone's on the same page. And actually, one of the projects I know you've been involved in, specifically in swimming, is this online platform that the Olympic champion set up, Adam Peaty. And having conversations about that, it effectively feels like, and again, I'm not a nutritionist, but actually looking at it, we're saying that any young athlete or parent that goes through a program should never come out the other end and not have a pretty damn good understanding across the board, across the ranges in terms of what they actually need nutrition wise, and then knowledge around it.
I think there are always frustrations. There's always limits in your resources and contact time whenever, whatever program or job you're doing. So sometimes you can find ways around it. But yes, if it was almost I was going to make a handbook or a curriculum as such, then I guess this is our curriculum of all the things we think a swimmer, most importantly as well, their parent, especially if they're younger, should know too. And again, like I said, it's about that getting someone to buy into nutrition. That's always the most important part, and that's the parent needs to understand that, and a swimmer does. And then you can get them to sort of leapfrog off of that into all the things that are relevant to know. And of course, normally my default is always the biggest bang for your buck. So the thing that I know, the information I know is going to give them maybe the biggest improvements in performance, or make training sessions way more enjoyable, get them to perform better in training, or help them grow and reach their athletic potential. So I always probably just focus on those because that's all we've got time for as such, whereas there's so many little helpful things and bits of information and smaller points that you can also incorporate. It's going to help you keep improving and moving forwards.
Well, one of the I was quite lucky. I had a kind of a flick through it and looked at some of the stuff from a nutrition point of view. And again, having sat in, I guess, the traditional pathway of nutrition development, if you like, it's very much bang, bang, bang. We've only got an hour, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas actually, when you see people talking through recipe cards and you guys in a kitchen and all of these different things that are going on, actually, it's kind of like, well, it's opened a lot more doors to what can be done, because traditionally, having run kind of camps for young athletes before, you've got an hour with them. Generally, it's in a classroom, and even if it's not in a classroom, the odds of being able to get the nutritionist in and then the psychologist in and then the essence, all with a really good like depth of understanding for the kids in like one day. Whereas this kind of moves away from that. It's almost not like school, but it's actually saying, look, let's not rush this. Let's do it properly over a long period of time. And I really enjoyed looking through some of the stuff as an adult, let alone the kids looking through it. So do you have kind of aspirations to potentially do this with other sports or things like that? Have you seen huge value in it?
Yeah, I've seen huge value in it. I think it'd be great to do for other sports. I think probably the biggest bit is the being able to really make information bite size, because it gives you, and spreading the information out over such a long period of time and having that regular drip feed of information, so you can quickly watch a 60-second video and then that might be on your mind for the next week, thinking about what you're doing. And then you've got another one that following week and you can really build on someone's understanding. Because often as well, we think, we'll look and we'll go, oh, swimmers that age, they had that workshop last year, they know it already. Whereas actually the amount of times I have to repeat myself and incorporate the same message in lots of different ways, in games and activities and infographics, and me repeatedly saying it, that's when it will sink in. So you really need a platform like this to do that with.
So as a practitioner, I guess, because I'm sure there'll be lots of non-nutrition people listening to this, the approach and the shift in approaches to working with athletes, especially younger ones, and actually the way in which we package up content, if you like, do you think that's kind of changed in the last few years? And kind of what are the things that you found that have been really useful to actually get sometimes quite dry information actually across in a really meaningful and practical way for young athletes?
Yeah, and I think it's the same for adults now as well. No one will read anything more than like 20 seconds. So I think probably if you asked me maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I'd be like, oh, I need to write an article or a book, a little booklet, or I need a large piece of text they can really read it and understand it. Whereas now anything that can, and I guess pandemic's pushed me even harder to be better at making small videos and making practical things as well. And I think probably in the last couple of years I focused more on practical sessions where we do something that's fun and engaging. They're always going to remember doing it.
I was going to say, can you share the example from one of the England camps a few years ago now, of taking athletes to the shops? Because I think as somebody who works with a whole range of athletes, I still find it staggering to see the range, I guess, of understanding when you take them into a shop, especially if they've never cooked for themselves before.
Yeah, and that's such a good, I've had some of my best sessions doing that, where I've been on camp with swimmers, and again, we might have 1 or 2 education sessions blocked in, but then we have a lot of other time that I can influence them and educate them. And I've done it with football academies where we'll just go around the supermarket. And often, and I think we'll all realise we do this, we go down the same aisles we normally form, whether it's a Tesco's Metro or a big supermarket, you always go down the same parts. So it's really good to have somebody make you go down other sections and point things out. So, know that there are other snacks available, know how to pick the cheaper apples, things like that, really. But they also teach me too, so I'll point out things I haven't seen before, so it's good.
Do you find as well, we talked about like engaging young people and even adults, actually, when we're talking about stuff like nutrition, the way in which ideas can get shared is probably a lot easier in terms of stimulating discussion. So for example, you could have a professional athlete in Australia put something on their Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is. A day later, one of your athletes is asking about it, and the day after that, they've learned how to cook, make, create, whatever it is, and they're eating it, whereas perhaps that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
Yeah, so that can be a positive. That can also be a frustration of mine or a challenge to me. So I'll give you an example of this time last year when Game Changers, the movie, came out on Netflix. Trying to promote a vegan diet. There was a lot of really ill-informed science on there, but because of the sort of marketing around it, it had such a strong message, aggressive message, and because it was specific to athletes, for example, it had quite a big effect on a lot of people that I worked with, and maybe they tried to go vegan for a couple of months and either made themselves quite ill because they didn't do it necessarily in the right way. And it is possible, it's totally possible, of course it is, but Yeah, sometimes when an athlete might just post a little snippet of something they're doing and they think it's quite harmless, and lots of people post pictures of their food, and there's a very good example of, I think, Chris Froome doing this on posting a breakfast, and it's like 2 or 3 eggs and a little bit of avocado. Think about the amount of cycling he was doing at that time then, thinking how on earth would that be a big enough breakfast for someone? But that was one of his many meals that day for a rest day, for example. But there was no context to it. But of course, you might be a 13-year-old swimmer and you see a swimmer you love who's drinking a protein shake because their sponsors asked them to do it, paid them to do it. And then you've got that swimmer's got it in their head, they've got to have a protein shake to be as good as that swimmer.
Yeah, I mean, you give the example of that Netflix documentary, and I was doing a parent talk whenever it would have been pre-lockdown, and I remember sitting in front of a group of athletes and a hand going up at the end of just a standard presentation, any questions, and somebody asked me about it, and it completely took me off my feet. I was like, you're asking me about a documentary you've watched on Netflix as to how to influence your child's nutrition. I'm like, probably need to be speaking to a nutritionist quickly. And that was like a snippet of the experience for me. But yeah, and obviously we're talking about nutrition today, but I'm sure that happens in lots of different aspects. You hear the latest fad, whether it's type of clothing they're wearing, whether it's type of competition approaches that they use. Oh, I've heard somebody does this. Yeah, okay, well, that was for them, not necessarily for you. You must really bang your head against the wall on those sorts of things.
Yeah, they are incredibly frustrating. And I think the thing is, you have to remember that athletes don't necessarily, with social media and what you put online is so engineered and edited that it's not reflective of what's actually going on either. And you do need the context behind it too.
Yeah, context is a huge thing. I think kind of pulling all this together then, you've got so much experience with like this huge range of both sports and ages and professionalisms in terms of whether they're fully professional or complete amateur kids just having fun. What are kind of the cornerstones to your philosophy based on your experiences that actually say, regardless of kind of where you are on the nutrition journey, there's a few kind of principles that I stand by? What are those things for you?
I think it's what you do on average that counts, not on occasion. So if you think how many times you get to eat over the week, how many meals, snacks, drinks, opportunities, if the majority of them are in your favor and helping you reach your goal, great. Just because you had a chocolate bar at 2 o'clock in the afternoon doesn't mean all the wheels are going to fall off. And then I guess that then goes into my next one of you don't need to always start on Monday. I'll start on Monday, or I'll start next season, or I'll start when the season starts, or I'll start tomorrow. I've ruined today already. Don't ever like write your day or week or year off. Your next opportunity is the next snack or drink or meal you have to like get back on it, for example.
I find that really curious you mentioned that, because I think it was episode 18. And we weren't talking about nutrition, we were just talking about the common traits you notice in people that are generally really successful in sport. And one of the things that came up was around this consistency. So actually, it's not saying you need to be, weighing your food. And obviously some sports that is going to be key, but for the vast majority of people, they don't need to be 100%, 10 out of 10 all the time. But actually, if you put, and I find the visual stuff really helpful, or that works for me, to actually, take a picture of every meal, snack, drink that you have during the week. At the end of the week, put it as a collage and have a look at it and go, right, if I'm a swimmer, for example, and I'm 25 and I'm looking at that screen, am I thinking, yeah, there's a good range of colors, different types of food, etc., 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 or is there a lot of beige? And is that something you found that works with athletes in terms of actually getting them to realize what they're eating, or getting to understand what they're not eating?
Yeah, of course. And they might look at that week and think, yeah, great, that's what I eat. I know I'm doing. And I think probably another thing as well is that, we don't know what we don't know. So you can have an athlete you work with and you think they've got no idea what they're doing nutrition wise, but they're one of the best players on the team, and they just don't really buy into it, and they just don't get it. They just don't know what they don't know. So you've got to keep coming at them at different angles and get them to see it from a different point of view.
One of the things I noticed, kind of looping back to the stuff with the platform that you did with swimming, AP Plus, that the integration of having a psychologist re-emphasizing some of the points and it's S&C, and it's almost like everyone's singing off the same sheet. And I think having had, where are we now, about 30 odd guests on the show, all coming from different pages, if you like, actually some of the key messages that come around successful athletes, whatever level you're working at, there is this kind of consistency of language between coaches I speak to and athletes I speak to and parents or whoever it is. They don't seem to be over here with one and then over here with the next. Everyone just seems to be talking about the same sort of thing. And I think, is that something, especially like, and obviously you work with one of the big football teams, is that something that's quite a challenge to manage, because you've got kind of academies and you've got the different age bands and you've got all these different like ranges of staff that are involved on different days? Is that something that's a real headache to manage?
I wouldn't, do you know what? I wouldn't actually say it was a headache. It's almost like a bit of a dream sometimes, because really it's still another team. It's not the team of athletes, it's the team of staff, and they're actually a group of people very well educated. They've all had a little taster of the other disciplines probably as part of their education. And if you've got a good team, everyone respects each other's roles and areas of expertise, and you're all pulling in the same direction. So it's normally really, really great thing to be a part of and very enjoyable. What is difficult is when you're working as part of a team where you just don't get that time together. The sharing of information doesn't happen. And also I think probably not my biggest fears, but I think a little bit like the NFL America, where sometimes players make their own support team. You don't really want that happening in, say, football, for example, because all the information is at the training ground or within the club. So you don't really want players being like, oh, I'm going to have that nutritionist, I'm going to have that psych. I've already got a nutritionist and a psych at the club, and I'm going to have a physio who can come to my home. And because then you're going to get really, even however great those three practitioners are, you're still going to get information, really important information isn't going to get shared, and you're going to get the athlete being pulled in different directions.
I seem to think I'm just finishing off my master's in sports science, and I think one thing that's coming up quite consistently, looking across both from the literature point of view but from the practical point of view, is this integration. So actually it doesn't matter whether you're a nutritionist, psychologist, S&C, the coach, or the superstar professional player. Actually everyone forms a part of, and it almost feels like a spider's web where there isn't like a little island sitting off over to the side. Everyone kind of gets it, if you like, and even if that's just a baseline, that person deals with X, I understand why X is important, and if they ask me to deliver any key messages, I will reinforce those.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just the nicest place to work in when it's like that. It's just really great.
Awesome. Well, I've taken a lot away from that, and I know you've got 1,001 resources, so I'm going to make sure we put a few links to your website and all the other things you're involved in on our show notes, because it's such a vast area, and it's also something that I really enjoy talking with non-athletes about, like just family and friends, because even if they have no interest in sport at all, they still eat food. And actually it becomes quite a dynamic discussion when you start going, oh, have a listen to this. Even if it's like a controversial thing like Game Changers, they go, oh my God, I didn't believe that, or I agree with it, or I don't agree with it. But it actually becomes quite a really interesting discussion point for anyone in and out of sport.
Yeah, definitely. We have to remember is everyone has to perform. Most people have to get up and do a full day of education or work. So we need to perform well while we're doing it as well. And we want to be happy individuals that can, enjoy our downtime. So, our health is really important, and nutrition plays a big role in that.
Oh, that's a nice way to pull it all together. Jazz, thank you so much for your time this morning. Really enjoyed it. And no doubt a few things for people to go away and think about.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again there, Jazz, for such interesting insights into the world of nutrition. It's cool to see how someone who didn't even set out to be a sports nutritionist initially has been able to forge her own path to working with some of the world's best athletes. I like this topic of contextual understanding instead of painting everyone with the same brush. Working as part of a team and using the digital tools developed over the last 12 months to ensure we don't lose some of the great benefits of working remotely. And that final point from Jazz there really resonated with me. It's what you do on average that counts, not on occasion. A lovely way to round off another insightful podcast. A shout out to Steve Ingham at Supporting Champions, who Jazz referred to as being a key part of capturing her interest in becoming a practitioner. It's pretty cool to hear that, as Steve was also hugely supportive on a number of my ventures previously. Check Steve's team out on Twitter. They're at support_champs and their website supportingchampions.co.uk. Jazz is on both Twitter and Insta. Just search for Campbell Jazz, and we've included a link to her website in the show notes. The project we mentioned that supports young athletes on their swimming journey and developed by Olympic champion Adam Peaty is called AP+. Again, the links to which we've included in the show notes. On the theme of supporting people, our next show is a very pertinent one, off the back of what's been a very testing year for everyone. On Friday, we are sharing a discussion with the founder of the mental health and wellbeing platform GoVox. Quite simply, if you lead a team in the workplace, at a school or in a sports club, it'll be the most important 60-minute podcast you'll ever listen to. And I realise that's a very bold statement, but once you've seen and heard the story, you'll hopefully agree. Stay tuned and see you soon for another episode of the Rogue Monkey Podcast.